Pat today, who's going to be facilitating for us on this wonderful topic of the Scholarship of Teaching and Learning. And so I think I'll just actually pass on the mic to you, and we'll go from there. Thank you so much, Pat.
Thank you very much, Lavina. So hello, everyone. My name is Pat Mayer. I am from Nipissing University, which is in North Bay, Ontario, on the Robinson-Huron Treaty of 1850 and traditional territories of the Nipissing First Nation and the Anishinaabeg. It's my pleasure to join you today, and this was sort of as a webinar. This was something that just sort of sprung into my inbox one day when David said, "Hey, Pat, I need to talk to you about something." And he and I had recently been involved in some professional development, a micro credential with eCampus Ontario. And as soon as David, as soon as you put this to me, I was like, I know the people to get involved, which was my good friends Mel Hamilton and Brett McCullum, who are joining us today. And I will pass it over to each of them, as well as Lavina, to do a short intro to say how they come at this conversation. And then I am happy to take it over and facilitate a bit of a conversation. We want this to be really informal. We've probably got 20, 25 minutes worth of us talking. And then we definitely want to open it up to as much question and answer as possible. So, to speak about the Scholarship of Teaching and Learning and what's in it for me and what it can do for me as a faculty member, as a staff member, etc. We've got some excellent panelists here, and I will pass it to Mel first to do an introduction.
Okay, hello everybody, and I bring greetings from Treaty 6 territory in the homeland of the Métis in Saskatoon, Saskatchewan. So my name is Mel Hamilton, and I'm the director of the Center for the Scholarship of Teaching and Learning here at the University of Saskatchewan, and I'm also the president-elect for the International Society for the Scholarship of Teaching.
Excellent. Thanks, Mel. Brett.
Hi, I'm Brett McCollum, formerly with Mount Laurel University, where I was a chemistry professor for 15 years, but just in the past few months moved out to Kamloops, here in the traditional territories of the Secwépemc people, and I'm the director for the Center for Teaching and Learning here at Thompson Rivers University.
Awesome. Thanks, Brett. And Lavina, I'll let you introduce yourself, although you might be well known to this group.
Well, hi, everyone. As I mentioned, I'm joining here partly on behalf of CNIE and also as a faculty member with Athabasca University. Some of you may know, but my main area of research is actually looking at harnessing emerging technologies to support our pedagogical practices in education. So I'm particularly interested in looking at how that can be implemented in an online teaching and learning environment. So I'm just really looking forward to having our conversation today about SoTL.
Awesome. Thank you very much. And I guess I'll end with more of my interaction with the SoTL realm. So I am at Nipissing University, and I am the former dean of teaching at the university, now just a professor in physical and health education. But the reason I think that David sort of shoulder tapped me to try and lead this is I'm also the vice president for Canada of the International Society for the Scholarship of Teaching and Learning. And for many, 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 many years, I've been an associate editor and on the editorial board of the Canadian Journal for the Scholarship of Teaching and Learning, which I'll just note, Brett forgot that in his intro, but he's the editor-in-chief of that journal. So that's also why we asked him to come to the conversation. So to get started, as I said before, we've got about 5 questions, prompts to sort of initiate a panel discussion. If you have any questions midway through, please go ahead and put them in the chat. We might be able to insert them into our responses, but at the end, we are definitely going to take any and all questions in the remaining time that we have. So the first question to get started is, what is SoTL all about? So the title for this session was about what's in it for me, what's it all about. So we better start at the beginning. And I don't think, at least within the Canadian context, there's anyone more knowledgeable about this or anyone more enthusiastic about this than Mel Hamilton. So I'm going to pass it right over to Mel. What's SoTL all about?
Perfect. Thanks, Pat. That is a true story. I always say it's a good day to SoTL, and SoTL is my favorite four-letter S word. I'll talk about it all day if someone lets me. So, scholarship in teaching and learning really essentially is research on teaching and higher education. But I'm going to take it just a tiny step back a little bit about when we start in higher education and teaching, and most of us aren't trained in pedagogy or teaching practices. And so we come by it naturally, honestly, and through thick and thin and through trial and error. And so what I like to explain is a little bit of a teaching continuum, that when we start teaching, we just want to be good teachers. We'll learn how to create assessments, we learn how to do teaching strategies, and we hope they're effective and that students are learning somewhere along the way. But then as we get more comfortable in the classroom and we do a whole bunch of different things and we have great ideas, we might want to go to the literature and see if those teaching ideas or teaching strategies we're doing are effective. And so we call that transitioning into scholarly teaching, where we go to the literature and we consume what others have written about teaching in higher education. So that could be at your classroom level, it could be at the program level, and it might even be institutionally. And once we get comfortable kind of reading what the literature says, we might think, hey, like I've got a really good idea. My students really like what I'm doing in the classroom, or, I'm trying to teach things to my students and it's just not working no matter how hard I try. And I might want to do some research on that. And so we go from scholarly teaching, which is consuming the literature, to scholarship of teaching and learning, which is doing research on our teaching. And so that's kind of creating the literature that then those who are still curious might consume. So it's really taking an evidence-based approach to our teaching practices, conducting the research, and then most importantly, sharing that research with others so that they can use what you're using, whether it's effective or maybe lessons learned in the classroom.
Awesome. Thanks, Mel. I knew you'd have that concise, exactly what it's all about. I'm wondering, Lavina or Brett, if you have anything you'd like to add to what Mel has shared there.
One of the key things to keep in mind is, like all scholarly fields, it's about advancing knowledge. And we do that collectively. So it's engaging in that research using established, rigorous methodologies, and disseminating your findings, putting yourself out there, putting your research out there for others to critique. And as a result, we identify what aspects of our findings maybe we've introduced some bias, because we're close to our teaching. We feel really passionately about the work that we do. And as we allow others to provide feedback on our results, on our approach to our analyses, we're better able to identify ways that we can communicate those results that are sufficiently rigorous to stand up over time. And as a result, we are growing that body of literature as a community. And the objective is for it to then again be used by others to advance practice.
Yeah, sorry,
Go ahead.
Connie, go. I was going to say, if I may add, it's very interdisciplinary. Like it's not home to one discipline, too, just to build on what Brett said.
Yeah, exactly.
Lavina?
And the only thing other than that I want to add, and I agree with everything that's been said, it's been made so clear for me. I also think that there's sort of this culture that we're trying to share, where we want more people to be engaged in more reflective practices, I think, as teachers. So reflecting on how we're teaching, and then as Brett and Mel both mentioned, getting that feedback and using that as part of our research and seeing, how we've been doing things and how can we improve and advance the knowledge further, as both of you mentioned. So yes.
And I'll just echo what's been said, but also jump in with, there's a comment in the chat, and that bias is sometimes essential in examining our own pedagogical approaches. I think that's a critical piece, right? I don't think in many other spaces I would, have the opportunity to collaborate with someone who on educational technology. I do phys ed. Mel's discipline is nursing, and Brett's a chemist. So, it's that nice sort of like blending of all of those. And and stumbling or fumbling into that, because Mel, as you mentioned, we sort of initially fall into, I want to be the teacher that I saw or that I liked or that I was impressed by or inspired by. And maybe that's good enough for a couple of years, but as we get through a career in higher education, we ought to know why we're doing something, right? Or what's making this particularly poignant for our students. And we've sort of already touched upon our second question, our second prompt here, but I'll go back to it because I think it's important. So we do each come from different disciplinary backgrounds, right? And we work at universities or colleges of different sizes. And so the question is really about how SoTL fits within that context, right? So for my context, it's physical and health education, and I'm a small, I would almost say the smallest university in Ontario, right? Whereas Mel comes from a relatively much larger institution and a different discipline in nursing. Lavina, your institution is completely open, Canada's open university, Athabasca, and Brett, I think you're somewhere in the middle. But I'm wondering if anybody wants to speak to how SoTL fits in their context, whether that's a disciplinary context or an institutional context. What does it look like?
In my field, chemistry, we've had a disciplinary educational research journal for just over 100 years this year. I think we just passed our centenary. And so chemists have been thinking about the issues of teaching and learning for a very long time. But sometimes the questions I'm really passionate about in my research go beyond the individual discipline, and they're asking questions that are of interest to people in other disciplines. And that's where I see SoTL really fits in, because it can involve questions that are within your field, but also questions that have value to others outside of your field. And so in that sense, it's interdisciplinary and transdisciplinary, that it allows us to come together as a international community of professionals in higher education and have conversations about teaching and learning that are based in evidence, and we can advance each other's practice. So often I'll find myself going and looking at what are nurses doing around professional identity, because as chemists, we have not really thought about it in the same way that lawyers, nurses, teacher practitioners, and others have really dug into that question. And so we're able to draw from the knowledge that they've created and shared through their disciplinary communities, but also through the SoTL community, and advance the questions that I have in my teaching.
And Brett, that's interesting, because part of my research is on SoTL identity and how one becomes a SoTL scholar. And so when people ask me, like, who are you, Mel? What do you do? I, for a long time, thought, am I a nurse who engages in SoTL research, or am I a SoTL researcher who happens to be a nurse? And I would say now 100% I'm a SoTL researcher, or who happens to be a nurse. And in my context, now that I am the director of the SoTL Center, most of my work has to do with, we actually have some graduate programming at USask for people who are interested in advancing their SoTL knowledge, whether it be at the certificate level, the master's level, or even now we have a PhD in education that's starting in the fall with the SoTL focus. And so I always look at the way I'm doing my work is contributing to the SoTL community broadly, both nationally and internationally. And I've actually kind of forgot about my home discipline of nursing. However, I draw on the epistemologies and ontologies, or the ways that I was trained in, what I value, to build upon kind of where I am today.
That's really interesting. Yeah, I think I can also, in thinking about, you talked about interdisciplinary, I also thought about how I sort of started my academic career, which was initially really focused on the impact of educational technologies and sort of that integration, how can we use this to support our teaching and learning? But as I was going through, and actually I first encountered this term about pedagogy of care from nurses. so in nursing research. And I thought, oh, that's really interesting. And how does that translate into education? And so you're right. I think that there's a lot of elements that we can see applied in different ways. And it's been really interesting because I think when I first started off doing most of my teaching in a more face-to-face environment, and also in blended environments, and then moving to teaching fully online, I was actually quite struck by how different people communicate, but also how different people relate to others in this kind of setting. And so I think the SoTL piece was really important for me to always be continually reflecting on how I'm teaching, but also this idea of being able to actually step back and look at my specific context, so my specific classroom, as opposed to sometimes in educational research, we're often, taking on this position of being more of a neutral person doing the research as an investigator, for example, whereas in SoTL, we're really looking at, well, this is me, this is my context, and this is how I can reflect on and practice and build my practice better for my situation. So I think that's been really interesting for me as well. Yeah.
And I guess I'll back clean up here. I feel like for me in terms of discipline, so I at Nipissing University, I'm in a faculty of physical and health education, but my true discipline is probably one more aligned with outdoor education. And when I started as an academic, it really was very much I'm just teaching the way that I like, right? I'm just teaching the way that I know, whatever's comfortable with me. I was never that sage in sage on the stage. I sort of stumbled into the flipped classroom because that's kind of what I liked, right? Without knowing that there was a background or a story or a narrative or a research realm behind that. And so I feel like one of the things that SoTL has allowed me to do is sort of backfill my knowledge based on what I like to do, and that's not necessarily a bad thing. I think most of us might do that, but in my own context as well, I feel like some of the things that come from my discipline, right? So outdoor education, taking students outside the classroom, engaging with this lovely fake background here, the forest near Nipissing University. I've been able to bring stuff from my discipline into SoTL, right? So when we were all talking about during we're still in the global pandemic, but at the start of the pandemic, when we were trying to talk about, inclusive spaces that we could safely engage with our students in, the outdoors came, up as one of the top spaces. And so it was interesting to be able to use my disciplinary knowledge to improve the teaching and learning of my colleagues, of the students, keep everybody safe, et cetera, et cetera.
Yeah.
Now, I sort of blended this question on disciplinary background with institutional background, and I'm wondering if I can go back to all of you and say, so what does SoTL look like at your institutions? Is it valued? Where does it fit alongside regular or normal research, right? Is it an equal player? Does it fill the same buckets in tenure and promotion and things like that? What's the institutional context like at Saskatchewan, Thompson Rivers, or Mount Royal, and Athabasca?
So for us here, we're in Saskatchewan, we're actually having quite a few conversations over the last year about what that looks like. And actually, even the fact that we have a standalone SoTL center, which is separate from the Center for Teaching and Learning, shows that we, USask really values SoTL and people who engage in SoTL. And it's a brand new center. It opened last November. And when I came, I was surprised to see like how many people were already engaging. And there was an article published in 2016 about the landscape of USask. And there's like quite a few, over 50% of professors were already engaging in some sort of SoTL work. But what's more interesting to me is the tenure promotion path that you mentioned, and the fact that professors who are in somewhat of a teaching stream here at USask can only get up to associate professor, so they can't go to a full professorship. And they're starting to think about why is that? Like, why aren't we valuing teaching research as much as we're evaluating disciplinary research? And so there's conversations to see if we cannot make them equal. Full professorship, just like UBC, UT, U of C, people that have already done it and engaged in, to say it matters. If you want to do it, we value it.
Hmm.
Awesome. Thanks, Mel.
Wow. That's really
Lavina?
interesting. Oh, I was just going to add, I was just thinking about at Athabasca, we certainly, I don't know that we directly have something about SoTL, but we certainly have a lot of community of practices that have sort of sprung up across different disciplines, and some of them being across faculties and at the university level. But certainly, I think the goal for many of them is to start that conversation to hopefully influence some of the policymakers around, the university. So I certainly think there's a really important role for SoTL to help inform some of not only our own practices, but at the university policy level. So just thinking about how we approach things. I know, for example, recently there's been a lot of sort of thinking around, well, of course, AI, emerging technologies. How does that factor in? What are we going to do with this new sort of uncertainty and how that's going to affect the way that we teach and learn and how we assess our students. So that's, I think, a big conversation coming up these days. But yeah, it's been really interesting to see sort of this evolve over time. And I think this is sort of a continuous thing that we've been talking about, and this conversation is going to be ongoing, for good reason. So,
Excellent. And I think the sort of analogy that you gave there of popping up all over the place certainly fits with my experience. I feel like SoTL probably at my current institution, but also a number of other institutions where I've worked, that's how it's felt. It's been like a shotgun, right? It's like scatter shot. There's a little bit of SoTL over here, and there's a little bit of SoTL over there. And they may never even connect at an institutional level, even if they connect outwardly to the same organizations outside. So I find that really interesting about how SoTL as its own unique space fits alongside disciplinary research in these odd ways.
mm-hmm. And I was just reading Mel's comment there about it's really interesting about the discussion of real research versus what you do in your spare time. And I completely agree with that. I think sometimes, and I see this in other disciplines as well, it's kind of seen as extracurricular. It's so strange. And then and also I think when we look at sometimes earlier career researchers and more senior ones, we see sort of this divide of, the policies and that tenure package. There's sort of priorities related more to this emphasis on our research reputation. And so teaching sort of falls into the sidelines and it's not valued as much. And I think that again comes back to, having those conversations and thinking about how we can change those policies to more reflect an important aspect, I think, that we need to have in higher education, which is the teaching component, right? How do we better our teaching practices, especially with all these changes that we're seeing in multimodal ways of learning, right? So online, blended, all these different forms of learning. So,
and I think it's really an interesting systemic problem, because I would hazard to guess that some of it comes from typically in your PhD, you're very discipline research focused, and you're not even given the skills. You maybe now are, but definitely 20 years ago, you weren't given the skills to be a teacher. You were just sort of like expected to be a great researcher who falls into the classroom and fulfills that 40% of your job magically or by osmosis, or just like, out of the blue, versus given any training in it, right? And so that sort of how that relates to what we're seeing now about real research and tenure and promotion, but also about the research superstars at most universities are shouted from the rooftops, right? There's all these internal awards and, ooh, look, somebody did this, but there's not the same focus there for teaching and learning. Sort of going off on a tangent, except I think that they're all related.
Well, and I think too, if one of the biggest problems right now, or barriers, Connie, that we all talk about, is the fact that the Tri-Council doesn't have teaching focused grants, like, the SHIRC, the INSERT, the CHIR, they really don't. And I think if we could have these national grants that actually specifically celebrated some of that stuff rather than trying to bury it in categories, I think we would see that universities would have a better political uptake in some disciplines.
Hmm.
My observation or my experience is, I would say that SoTL is a community 10 years ago that was in its infancy. But right now we're in our teenager years, going through that growth spurt of puberty. That the journal, the Canadian Journal for the Scholarship of Teaching and Learning, its first issue was published in 2010, 13 years ago. We've gone from about 5 articles an issue to, we just published a recent issue that had 17 articles in it, and we already have our next issue ready to go with, I think there's 18 articles ready to go in it. So the journal's work has dramatically increased in just over a decade as a result of the growth of the Canadian community engaged in this work. Myself, I earned full promotion on the basis of my Scholarship of Teaching and Learning. I was at a university that valued it and that it was considered an important part of our research mosaic. At my current institution at Thompson Rivers University, just this spring, the University Senate passed a definition of what is SoTL. And so that, having that embedded within the university's terminology makes it much easier for units like mine, the center, to support faculty who want to engage in that systematic inquiry around teaching and learning as their research practice. It also supports faculty who are going through tenure and promotion procedures in terms of having their work recognized. The definition that we've adopted, it's a research-based approach to investigating and improving teaching and learning practices in post-secondary education. Faculty members who conduct SoTL contribute to the field of teaching and learning by using rigorous research methods, disseminating their findings, and making them available for critique and replication. And so having that now as a formal term really drives our community forward. And I think we're seeing that on a national scale right now. It's happening at most institutions in Canada that we're having conversations about SoTL.
I'm actually kind of curious, Brett. So what are some ways that that knowledge has been disseminated across your university?
So we have faculty who are doing internal disseminations through our annual Teaching and Learning Conference, but an important part of being a SoTL scholar is that external dissemination, engaging with the national and an international community to share your results and to bring their findings back to your own practice. And so attending conferences and national conferences like the Society for Teaching and Learning in Higher Education, the International Society for the Scholarship of Teaching and Learning, or your discipline-based educational research are great ways to go out there and share your findings, as well as to bring back results that you can apply or share with others.
And I just put a shameless plug in the chat there for iSoTL, which Brett had mentioned and Mel had mentioned, and I think one of the starting points that I see is exactly what Brianna has noted here, right? Like, so many instructors don't even realize they're doing SoTL, right? And it's just, that's where that shotgun analogy, I think, fits. It's like it's madly off in all directions. But if we are really to disseminate it and see its true value, then I think we do have to sort of be mindful of how that happens, which, again, all of these questions just flow so nicely together. We've already started to touch upon the, how might we disseminate it, or where we might disseminate it. And so I'm wondering if any of our panelists have thoughts on that. I know that we've talked a bit about journals, conferences, webinars, etc. Anything to share there, Mel, Lavina, or Brett?
One of the things I really want to emphasize for everybody online today is how collaborative and supportive the SoTL community is. And if you ever get a chance to go to a SoTL conference, you will see for yourself, everybody there is passionate about teaching and learning, and there's no hierarchy in the SoTL community, which may not be the same as your home discipline that you come from. And people go and you will meet 50 of you new SoTL best friends while you're there, and you come out with collaborations and possible research projects on 5 or 10 things, and you don't even know the people that you're going to be collaborating with, but people will sit down with you and have a discussion about your curiosities, your reflections, how you might put that into a project, or if you have a project and you're stuck, people are willing to sit down and help you. And when I went to my first iSoTL conference in 2017, I was like, finally, I met my people. And I've never left, because I can't believe that there's a group of people internationally that would be that supportive of an early career researcher getting into a different type of research than their discipline-based conventions.
I'd say one of the great ways to connect with the community is, if you are not yet, start reading the journals. So read the Canadian Journal for the Scholarship of Teaching and Learning. Teaching Learning Inquiry is the official journal of iSoTL. As you begin to engage with articles, even just reading the abstracts and the methods, you get a sense for what are the approaches that people are using to investigate teaching and learning. And what really excites me about the community is the methodologies are all over, in that we're drawing together the approaches that people use from their disciplines across the academy, and you get to see so many different approaches for investigating teaching and learning. So again, I'm a chemist. My background, I'm a radiation chemist who did research at Canada's facility for particle and nuclear physics. That's my background, counting radioactive muons, 10 million in half an hour, statistical methods. Whereas now, over time, I've adopted, I've learned different approaches. And so I love doing research where I'm investigating human experience and the variations that emerge within a population. And so I've had to work with other faculty from other disciplines to say, I have a research question I don't know how to answer. I don't even know where to begin. What do you do in your discipline with this type of question? And then they can steer me in that direction to find appropriate tools that can allow me to ask that question, collect data, and analyze data to have meaningful results that can inform my practice and that of others. So with the journal, one of the things to keep in mind is your research ethics. So I encourage you, if you don't yet have your TCPS2 certification, go to the government website. I put it in the chat. Go through that process, and that'll help you as a starting point for ensuring that you can engage in your research ethics with that certification in place, and then engage with your research ethics board at your institution, because they can help guide you on expectations, so that when you collect data on or with your students, that you're doing so in compliance with institutional and government expectations.
And
Thanks.
to build on what Brett said, is there's kind of always a little bit of maybe a little bit sometimes of an argument between, should you get ethics for SoTL or should you not, particularly when students are your participants. But I always like to say is get your research ethics, regardless if you think it's quality assurance, because sometimes people have a missed opportunity that they think they're doing quality assurance or program evaluation, and they collect data from students and they haven't had ethical approval to disseminate broadly or widely. And so then they'll write an article that might not be allowed to be published because there isn't an ethics disclaimer there. So I always say, when in doubt, get your ethics. And then that just allows you to disseminate more broadly, more widely, and contribute more to the community.
And again, I think the critical piece here is just, learning. And, if we've done a PhD in, a hard science, then the conversation about how do you involve humans in your in your research, the power dynamics, etc., isn't something that you necessarily engaged with before, right? It's a ignorance is bliss. And so I think that's what's important here, to think about how these things fit together when you're doing research on people, with people, in order to better the learning outcomes of people. So
Yeah, and I think also in addition to the research element, there's also that practice component. So I'm coming at it from also a technology angle, but I was just thinking that in some ways technology has also opened up so many opportunities for us to observe other people in their teaching practices. So, for example, I was thinking about back when I used to do more face-to-face teaching, there were a lot of times when I would have to physically be in that classroom and actually go to that classroom, which isn't always possible, let's say across campus. But now with it being online, there are some opportunities for you to actually be an observer in someone else's class and say, oh, hey, that's a really great strategy that you've done there. And then sort of start that conversation and to see how, what kind of activities happen in this kind of space, and really sort of building that camaraderie, I think, and having, again, that collaborative space for teachers too, because we're thinking about the teachers, we're also thinking about the students, like there's so many people involved. And I just think it's so incredible how now with technology, we're able to do all these things. And you can even, for example, record it if we wanted to and see how that looks from, in hindsight. So sometimes reflecting over something several times, because as you know, it's like reading a book. Every time you come back to it, there's sort of an extra layer. Sometimes there's another layer of interpretation as you're going back and thinking, hey, I didn't notice this part before when I was teaching. And so I think all of that, thinking about practice in addition to the research or developing into some further research is also a really interesting component of SoTL and thinking about the technology piece as well. So,
Well, thanks everyone for that, those thoughts and comments to my sort of arbitrary yet well-flowing prompts. We did want to recognize, I mean, we've got a limited amount of time today, but we did want to open it up if folks had questions. So it's not just the talking heads on Zoom, but it's a discussion. So if folks have questions, you can put your hand up as David did. You can keep yourself, off the camera if you like. You can put the question in the chat, whatever you like. We've got about 20 minutes now, and please remember, it's our intention that this is a starter, right? This is a first conversation of like, there's a spark here that leads to a grander SoTL conversation after the holidays in 2024 sometime, because as Mel said, she just wants to collaborate all the time with everybody. So, and David, you've got your hand up first.
Thanks. Oh, thank you, Pat, Brett, Melanie, and Lavina for this discussion. It's been great. I'm going to start with a shameless plug for CNIE before people head off to their afternoons. And then I do have a question for you. So, yeah, I recognize that there are a lot of folks here who aren't members of CNIE. Welcome. Do check out our website and look ahead to our events. We are in the middle of planning an online conference for May 15th. We'll have details to share in January. So if you sign up for updates or for a newsletter, then you'll get some information on that. And I would also invite anybody who's actively engaged in SoTL to consider submitting a presentation. The Canadian Network for Innovation in Education covers a lot of areas, a lot of research and pedagogy, multiple levels, and not just in the education sector, also in the private sector. We really need to expand some of your collaborations and networking with some CNIE members. My question for you, all of you on the panel are involved in post-secondary education, and you're talking about interdisciplinary research in SoTL. Do you have much experience going between the levels, between post-secondary, secondary, and primary?
I can take this. So in the K-12 system, SoTL is not readily known right now. It's if you talk to educators or people who are in education in K-12, they'll often call it educational research rather than SoTL research. However, because of the fact that we're talking about things like AI and work integrated learning and all these new technologies, we're starting to find conversations going between, particularly in the high school setting, like how are you preparing students to use ChatGPT so we know what we're going to be seeing when they come into post-secondary. And so I think there's more conversations happening and opportunities for conversations to happen with K-12. And I really hope that that uptake happens across Canada more and more as we see that there's a pretty big gap sometimes between what's happening in the K-12 classroom and what we expect when they come into post-secondary. So thank you for bringing that up, David.
And I would echo that. I think I don't necessarily feel it's a problem per se, but there's this unwritten tension, or however you might like to put it, between SoTL and I think just education research in general, right? Which at least at my own institution does seem to fill the void within the K-12. Like that's the realm of the education department, the education program, the education profs who went and did a doctorate in education, versus SoTL, which at least on the surface at my institution is more in the realm of how we better the higher ed landscape, and is done by researchers across disciplines, definitely inclusive of education profs, but not solely the realm of education profs. And I think where we get into some sticky business too, at least in a research space, is, you know, below or above that age of 18, right? And so, you know, the including our students as partners, and that conversation is relatively straightforward at a higher ed level where they're adults and perhaps not so much when they're 7.
Mm-hmm.
On
So
the, go ahead.
Go ahead. Sorry. I was just going to say, I think you both hit the nail on the hammer. And I think there's a lot of overlap between educational research and SoTL. And so that's why there's in some ways, I actually think that by advancing one, we're actually advancing the whole. So both of those areas. So I do come from a background of K-12 education, but I do think that while there is different pedagogies informing how we teach and learn in, for younger children and for youth, so in pedagogy and thinking about hedagogy and andragogy, I think ultimately there's a lot to be gained from looking at both. And I think that they both have their own place, and that they can share a lot of those, I guess, shared insights between the two. So I don't think they're in competition per se, even though you say that, yes, there's tensions, there are. Ultimately, I don't know if at least this is my perspective, I don't know that I care so much about the distinction between the two as much as I care about partaking in both and seeing, sort of the shared common goals of both, approaches. So that's sort of my view there.
I'd add that there's cross-pollination between the two communities. But when you go to publish, it's good to really understand who is the data that you're publishing about. Because if it's K-12 students that your research question is focused on, then an education journal is the appropriate venue. If your research question is focused on learners in a higher education setting, then a SoTL journal might be the right choice for you. But as an example, many of the SoTL journals, including CJ SoTL, we exclusively publish research that is in a higher education context.
And just to build on Pat a little bit too, is when we're getting ethics approval, if we're doing it in the K-12 system, it means ethics approval from superintendents and school boards and parents. And so one of the things that we've kind of done is if we're having conversations about SoTL in K-12, is that perhaps maybe people are engaging with research participants who are their fellow teachers, or maybe professional development facilitators in K-12, and not the students as the participants themselves. So that's one way to kind of avoid having the messy business of parent approval for ethics.
Yeah. Cora, I see your hand.
Oh, thanks. Thanks for the conversation. Going way back to near the beginning, I think it was Brett who mentioned like interdisciplinary learning from colleagues and I do a lot of work with our community at the University of Toronto around SoTL, and we've over the years intentionally brought together different disciplines. And so one current program we have is the SoTL writing cohort, and they are grouped in threes where they have to peer support one another and give feedback. And so they are across disciplines, and one of the key things they have to do is articulate what their discipline is and make it make sense to people from outside their discipline. And we thought that will be helpful. And maybe I'm looking at people here who mentioned they are journal editors. You know, maybe I'll have to call you in for one of our sessions, but just that interesting angle of making your work sort of speak beyond your own discipline, right? So we have math with someone who's an English language learner faculty, plus somebody else from political science. And, you know, it's something we're intentionally doing. And I don't know if anyone else has had any experience in that and how valuable it can be. I think it is valuable. That's my take. And I think that supports what Brett said in the beginning. That's just my comment.
I can hop in on that one. I agree, Cora. I think it's incredibly valuable, and I'll just highlight something that I'm involved with and aware of from the University of Toronto, right? And so that's this failure learning in progress, which is a group of folks, you know, talking about how teachers engage with failure, how students learn from failure, and I was asked to come into this alongside a whole bunch of other external folks because maybe they just felt they needed more people in the conversation. But I think it was also the branching out of, we've had wonderful conversations across disciplines at the University of Toronto. Now let's see what people outside of the University of Toronto, from Nipissing, from the University of Missouri in the US, from McGill, etc., think about this and talk about this and potentially collaborate in future scholarship about this. So just a plug for that model. Anyone else have a thought? Mel, Lavina, Brett?
See, Deborah has her hand up as well. Go ahead.
Thanks, Lavina, and everyone. So, just following up from Pat and Cora's comments. At a previous institution, I've worked at a lot of institutions in a few different countries, but at a previous institution, we had teaching and education institute, and they offered 6 to 12 month secondments for faculty, especially junior faculty, but not exclusively, who were looking at innovating their teaching and learning practices. And so people could apply for these secondments, and the secondments covered somebody to replace their teaching for an interim period. And the value in that was they were able to sit in a room, virtual and otherwise, with people from other disciplines and start to build their project with advice and suggestions and input from other people. And it was a very collaborative process. I participated in one. It was just a wonderful experience. And then published, but also that was in Australia. And also in Australia, they had at that time an award that a competitive award that you could apply for innovating your teaching practices and exploring and expanding on work that you are doing off the side of your desk or in your spare time, as you said earlier, Mel, to do this. So yes, it's a very invigorating process.
And that's something else I think that's important to note. You just said invigorating. I think one of the things that I enjoy about doing SoTL work is being inspired, right? And it's inspiring work, just like it might be in my disciplinary realm to do X, Y, and Z research. It's also inspiring to know, geez, something that I thought of on a whim, they've been doing over in that other discipline for 50 years, and here's all the lessons that they learned. I should have looked there first and not reinvented the wheel.
Well, and I like how you said that, Pat, is that not reinventing the wheel by hence going back to the literature and seeing what is out there. And then like what people have figured out already that works or doesn't work. And the other thing I love about SoTL is we can report on those failures that, you know, you can go to a conference and say, hey guys, I tried this and it failed miserably, and this is why. And so we're comfortable living in the space of being able to say we learn from each other and we learn from what didn't work rather than always what works. And so that's another thing that's refreshing, is it always doesn't have to be perfect. And we're not trying to present perfect data, and we're not trying to be the newest, latest, greatest above everybody else. It's like, I want to learn from the people that have come with me, beside me, and before me, so that I can just give the students the best experience possible.
Mm-hmm. And I like that you mentioned, you kind of touched on that idea of having this safe space, right? This very collaborative, safe space to talk about these things, whether they be things, like you said, some of our failings, but also some of the things that we've done really well. So you're absolutely right. Hmm.
And I consider the CNIE community in terms of that focus on innovation and education. And I just think about one of the things that drew me into the SoTL community was what was happening in my classroom around the year 2011, 2012. I'd been asking my students, what's your favorite genre for reading? And it was a icebreaker to help them connect with peers. And I'd have one or two students a semester that would say, I don't have a favorite, I don't like reading. And so then, okay, well, what's your favorite movie? Something you can share. But 2011, something changed. And I had about 15% of my class said they don't read for leisure. And the next year, it was half of my class. And then it sat steady after that. Around 75% of my students don't engage in reading for leisure. And I had to ask, what is going on in my classroom that has dramatically changed the way my students are spending their leisure time? And if they're not reading for leisure, are they engaging with their textbook in the way that I hope they are? Well, the answer was the smartphone. Technology had changed the way people use their time, and that changed the way that they were learning and engaging with learning, as well as engaging with each other. And so I had to rethink, what am I doing in the classroom in order to provide a meaningful learning experience that's engaging for my students as a result of something that was entirely outside of my control, a new technology that had emerged on the market. And that's a big part of the conversations that we have in the SoTL community, is what is changing in the world that requires a response from educators to ensure that education is still a positive, constructive, and meaningful experience.
That's really interesting. And I think it points back to the idea of that relationship, right? That changing relationship over time based on, things happening in society and advancements. And you mentioned technology. Although I do think that in some ways, like you mentioned the reading example, I wonder if the reading has just changed. So you mentioned the smartphone. So what kind of, perhaps the content or the way that they're digesting it, the smaller pieces and things that are curated and recommended to them, the reading is just different now, the kind of leisure reading that we're talking about. And as you mentioned, maybe now it looks a bit more multimodal in form, as opposed to just text. So I'm just putting out there. I'm just thinking about, like, there's reading. We used to think of reading as just being, like a novel, but I wonder if leisure reading now looks a little more, just looks different.
And the speed at which it comes at you. If I just
Yeah.
think about my own self and reflect on myself, right? Like the news used to be something that I savored, and I sat down with my newspaper on a Sunday and I read through this physical thing. But now I'm getting my news probably every 30 seconds because something dings into my inbox, and it might be an email from one of you lovely people, or it could just as likely be a news story about the volcano in Iceland or about something, and I'm just getting it
Mhm.
constantly, right? So I think there's all kinds of ways in which we could reflect on ourselves
Yeah.
and then reflect on the changes we're seeing in the students, and then just also recognize the changes that we're seeing in the world, right? The
Mhm.
advent of the smartphone, the advent of social media, et cetera, et cetera.
Yeah. It also
Well,
makes,
and
oh, sorry, go ahead, Mel.
I was gonna say, and to build on Brett's example, one of the things we say in SoTL is to be used by others. And so when I was teaching nursing, I would concur that we were having the same problem since we're admitting they weren't using their textbooks. And this is like medical, surgical, pediatric nursing, they weren't reading it. And so what I could do is take the study that Brett did and then use it in my own context, and people share. And so Brett would be happy to share, Mel, give you my data, give you my data collection tool, and then you can replicate the study in your own classroom. And that's the other thing that SoTL is really well known for, is that we will share our information. We don't protect it as a proprietary thing. It's like, I will use it. Here's my data collection tool. Use it, adopt it as you want, and then and do your engage in your own research. So that's just the other thing to build upon. And thanks, Brett, for mentioning that.
I guess with 2 minutes left, I'll just open it up if any of our panelists have last thoughts, follow-ups that they'd like to add on to. Otherwise, I'm mindful of people's time on a Tuesday so close to Christmas, and also remind everyone that this is an ongoing conversation. I think if we've seen some valuable things pop up here, there may be more on SoTL in the new year. So Lavina or Mel or Brett, any last thoughts?
Thanks for inviting me, Brett or Pat, and it's good to see everybody and meet new people.
Awesome.
Yeah, thank you for the invitation. And we're always happy to connect with new people. So please reach out to any of us if you have more questions.
Absolutely.
Yeah, thanks so much to everyone. This has been really inspiring and really motivating for, I think, for myself, but also for everyone here. So thank you so much for coming, and wishing everyone a restful break, and we'll see you in the new year. Thank you so much, Pat, again, for facilitating as well.
No problem. Thank you,
away.
everyone.
Thank you.
Take care, everyone.